Lord of the Rings, one of the best modern trilogies based on J.R.R. Tolkien's work, capturing the hearts and minds of millions of fans around the world. Now, something you may not have considered is how absolutely perfect the swords are designed in this cultural behemoth, and every other franchise does not even come close. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant. Now, before we get stuck into the swords today, let's talk a little bit about terminology, just so when I reference something you guys know what I'm talking about. So starting off, let's have a look at this cruciform sword and go through all the parts and what they do and what they're for. So starting right down the bottom, we have the pommel of the sword. This is basically a big weight on the end of the sword to act as a counterbalance. This will dictate what the weight profile of your blade is. Also, the peen goes behind the pommel that actually holds the entire thing together. Then moving up, we have the handle, usually made out of wood, wrapped in some cord and then some leather. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you guys know what a handle is. It's what you hold. Then going up a little bit further, we have the crossguard or guard, depending on what type of blade it is. A crossguard is used primarily for defenses to protect your hands from incoming strikes, but it can be used for offense as well. Then moving up, we have the actual blade. Now, the blade is a little bit more nuanced than it might first seem. First off, we have the profile taper. That means where the blade gets thinner as it gets towards the point. Then we have the distal taper. Now, the distal taper is the thickness of the blade, going from really thick down near the handle and the crossguard to really thin down near the point. So this can remove weight. Then we have the fuller, not a blood groove. A lot of people call them blood grooves. The fuller is to remove weight while also adding some structural rigidity. Then we have the bevel. That is what does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the cutting, but the bevel and the edge are not the same thing. The edge is actually the sharp part. That's the part that does the cutting. And then finally, we have the cross section. So the cross section of the blade is, if we cut the blade in half and we look straight down it, the shape of the blade. There are lots of different types of cross sections, lenticular, convex, concave, you name it. There's a lot of different cross sections. All right, now that we know our general terms for swords, let's get stuck in. Starting off with sting, which is it's kind of a short sword more than anything else, but it is beautifully designed. In terms of functionality, this is completely functional. This is a sword that you could take straight from, the movies, the page, bring it into the real world, and it would be 100% functional. There isn't really too much to critique about it. The blade looks fantastic. It's a good length. It's a very, I would say subtle leaf blade. It has a good cross guard. The thickness doesn't look too bad. The lines don't look too bad. The pommel at the end probably isn't, I would say, heavy enough to counteract this thickness of blade, but because it is such a shorter blade, it wouldn't matter too much. Now, this blade could still obviously thrust. It has a great point to it. However, it would be a little bit more of a chop-centric blade. There would be a little bit more weight in the swell. The handle is a little bit, I would say, non-textured, so your hands might slip on it a little bit, especially if you're wearing gloves or gauntlets. However, we do have the crossguard to stop your hand slipping onto the blade and slicing your fingers off. So overall, this is a fantastic design. There's maybe a couple of little personal preference things here, maybe some weight distribution things that I personally would fix, but relatively speaking, this is a 100% functional dagger, short sword type design. Next up, we have Aragon's Ranger Sword. This is a fantastic design. Now, this is going to be kind of a common theme that we see with a lot of the Lord of the Rings swords, and that is they kept it simple. A lot of the people who made Lord of the Rings, the films and stuff, they brought in actual, bladesmiths and blacksmiths to design the swords. So they didn't go completely crazy with the fantasy designs and the fantasy aspects. They've made them functional. They have slight fantasy aspects to them, and this is a perfect example of it. This is a very, I would consider to be, to the average person, probably like a plain sword. This doesn't look like it's a crazy fantasy design, and because of that, it's really functional. It's really great. The pommel is absolutely proportional to the blade. It's also a very nicely contoured pommel. Then when we move up to the handle is very plain looking. It's just a black leather oval wrapped handle. perfectly fine, perfectly functional. Then we have that steel riser in the center. Usually when you have a riser on a sword, you're going to have a little bit of, for example, a little bit of cord. You can't really see it on camera, but there is a riser here in the middle that is to give separation of your hands, right? This one here being steel, I don't see anything too particularly bad about it. As long as it's well made, perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable to separate the single or two-handed use. Then we come up to the crossguard. The crossguard's a little interesting because it has this kind of extension design. If you have a look at a lot of the crossguards on all of these swords, they start where the handle ends. However, on this one, it's got a little extension coming down from the crossguard onto the handle. I don't think it's a big deal. It's more just a manufacturing thing. That's a lot of effort to do to fit the handle to that little kind of joinery bit with the crossguard. But in terms of the crossguard design, it's a very subtle sweeping up. It has nice grind lines that almost become triangular, which I think is absolutely beautiful. For example, if you look at this one here, this is a rather straight crossguard. This one sweeps up ever so subtly, like this one here. This one kind of sweeps up. The crossguards are really, really impressive when it comes to a lot of the Lord of the Rings swords. I'm going to quickly go and explain why, because there's actually a lot of nuance behind the design of a crossguard. It seems like a very simple piece, right? We see it all the time in movies and TV shows. If we just do a simple crossguard design like you might see in some sort of game, that's what it looks like, just like that. And then if we look at it at a different angle with the blade facing towards us, let's just say it's something like this with the blade here looking straight down. This is not how crossguards are designed. Now, obviously there are lots of different designs of crossguards, of course, but if we keep with this sort of design, let's talk about the nuance of the grind. So same sort of crossguard, however, flare it out the tips a little bit more, bring it over. It's a lot thinner. You don't need that much material when it comes to a crossguard to protect your hands. But this is not the important aspect of a crossguard. This one is, because if we look at this sort of angle, and the blade is here facing towards you, all of a sudden you can see the huge difference. This removes a whole bunch of weight and material. It doesn't need to be thick like this. You can have a lot more nuance in the design. You know, these here, these grind lines here, these sweeping up, these grind lines here. Lord of the Rings does a lot of this, which is absolutely bang on. A lot of other movies and TV shows, media, that sort of stuff, does this sort of thing, especially common in anime and like games and stuff. This is just big bars of steel. No refining, no nuance. This is a nice crossguard. That one's good. In terms of the blade design, very plain, but like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. In fact, that actually means it's a good thing. It means that it's a functional design. They haven't done anything crazy like adding spikes or giant serrations or any of that sort of stuff. They've kept it simple, they've kept it nice. It doesn't have too much of a profile taper. Personally, I would like a little bit more of a profile taper. It's a very plain looking blade in general, which means quite functional. Next up, Anduril, Flame of the West. Very interesting sword, especially if we look straight down to that pommel. The pommel and the handle are almost integrated. You know, it comes all the way up to basically halfway up the handle. It's very interesting because that might be really, really heavy. In terms of functionality, if you were to bring this into the real world, this truly depends on how it was made or manufactured. The blade looks fine, doesn't have too much of a profile taper, but you could fix that up by giving it a nice distal taper, right? The crossguard is perfectly reasonable. It's quite beautiful, quite very, very striking, I would say. I'm a big fan of this this crossguard design. The handle is a nicely contoured and leather wrapped with a lot of risers on it, which is a comfortable handle, something very similar to this one. However, that pommel coming all the way up, I think you could make it work. I know that there are functional versions of Anduril people have made, so it is a functional design. You can make it work. It's just probably a lot of manufacturing costs to actually get it right, to get the weight right, get the weight distribution right. But in terms of its design, there's nothing really here that jumps out at me as bad. Now, something I should mention is I've actually handled the official replica of this sword, and it is terrible in terms of its weight. It's not a real sword. A lot of the official official replicas, this is an official replica right here. They are not real weapons, they are display weapons. They are not balanced correctly, they're not made out of the right materials in terms of carbon steels or stainless steels. They are purely to look beautiful on a wall. They are not actually designed to be real weapons. This is a real sword here, these are real training swords here. The weight distribution of the official replicas versus actual blades, 100% different, not even in the same realm. So if you've handled one of the official replicas and you're like, they're so heavy, it's nowhere near actually accurate at all. I just thought I'd bring that up because a lot of these things I'm talking about, if they're actually properly made, with carbon steel blades, properly designed. Now, next up, let's get to Boromir's sword. This is in the, I would say the top 2 or 3 best swords in the entire trilogy. So starting off with the pommel, a beautifully comfortable, simple pommel. This fits in your hands perfectly fine. Like I said, this sword here, before it was a custom, was very, very similar and loosely based off the Boromir. So that type of pommel, in terms of its shape and design, fantastic. When it comes to the handle, we obviously have that leather wrapped handle with all those little risers in it. Like I said, same with these ones, perfectly comfortable, perfectly reasonable. The crossguard it sweeps up a little bit further than a lot of the other designs, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. Still has adequate hand protection. We have the twisted quillions, beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful design. The blade though is the real showstopper. It starts off really thick at the base, then we get that nice, beautiful taper towards the tip. Then when it comes to the fuller, going 3/4 of the way up, removing a lot of that weight of the broad blade, but then at the tip we keep all of that structural rigidity. Absolutely fantastic in terms of its design. Like I said, Boromir's sword is one of the top 3 I would put, and I'll tell you my top 3 when we get to them at the end. If you're enjoying today's episode, you should consider subscribing. That was loud. Subscribe. Next up, let's go with perhaps a little bit more of a negative one. I've spoken about a lot of the positives of all of the blades so far. Most of them have been 100% functional and perfectly valid designs. Let's get to some of the shitty ones. So Elron's sword, this one here is by far the weakest one we've looked at so far. It's kind of shit, honestly. So starting off with the handle, it doesn't really have a good counterbalance like a pommel. This one is a very blade heavy type sword, so it's more for chopping than anything else, than fine point control, let's say. In terms of the handle shape and design, I mean, it is very round, so edge alignment is going to be a little bit more difficult. So if it's round and I don't know where my edge is, then it's going to make it a lot harder to actually cut somebody. So having indexing, it means that you have a handle that is shaped in such a way when you hold it, intrinsically I know where my edges are, my primary or secondary edge. And this becomes even more paramount when you're wearing gloves or gauntlets or something like that, because you lose a lot of dexterity in your fingers and your hands. If you look how thick these gloves are here compared to my actual finger, when I hold a sword with these are just light sparring gloves, it means that if I have even an oval handle, they can be a lot harder to get your edge alignment right, especially when you're doing complex techniques. So having a more contoured handle means that it's a lot easier in the hand to be able to make sure you are striking correctly with that edge at all times. So edge alignment is obviously really important, but the contoured handle is really important to get your edge alignment right. It doesn't look to have any sort of texture or grippy surface on the handle, meaning the moment the handle gets wet or you're wearing perhaps gloves or gauntlets, it's going to be really difficult to hold onto the handle without it slipping. And then you couple that with the fact that it doesn't have proper indexing to know where your edge is, it just makes this blade a lot harder to use. Then when we get to the blade itself, for some reason it has this weird kind of design. We have a primary cutting surface by the looks of it, and no sharpening on the back edge, but then towards the handle it does look like it has a little bit of a false edge. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. We have these little kind of I would say spikes that I'm assuming are supposed to maybe deflect or catch blades. This one here is not very good. Now, could you use it? It's still a sharpened piece of steel. You could probably still functionally use this, but this is not a well designed fantasy sword. This one here, it looks kind of cool, I guess. I think there are other better designs, especially elven designs in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies, but this one here by far is the weakest design, especially down near the handle, the lack of guard. It's definitely the weakest. Moving on to Gandalf's sword. Now this is personally my favorite sword in the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. It may be one of my favorite fantasy swords ever to exist. It is gorgeous. Starting down with the pommel, we have what I would consider to be a faceted type pommel. However, it seems to be smooth on the top side. For example, if we look at this one again here, this is more of a faceted pommel, right? But it's faceted on all sides. Perfectly reasonable. Gandalf's looks like it still goes up a little bit further, kind of like Andurill's does, which in this case, it's not as extreme, so it's perfectly fine. Then we have that leather wrapped and, wire risers underneath the leather. Perfectly reasonable. It's a little thin for my taste. I would like it. Like I said before, I like a little bit of a thicker handle, but still perfectly usable and perfectly practical and functional. Just a little bit of personal preference in there. Then when it comes to the crossguard, sweeps up ever so gently, kind of like this one here. In terms of its thicknesses, its weights, all absolutely fantastic. Then when we get to the blade here again is one of the best parts of it. The reason why, this is a very subtle leaf blade. Now, I'm not entirely sure how this one would handle, because obviously this is in the shape and the design of a longsword, and longswords you want some really good point control, but because we have a swell on the blade, that very subtle leaf blade design, it means that there's going to be a little bit more weight up towards the top portion of the blade. So I'm not sure how the tip control would be, but it's still 100% functional and practical. I'm just very curious from a user standpoint how a real Glamdring would actually be and how it would feel in the hand. Next up, we have Legolas's fighting daggers, short swords. I'm not sure entirely how big they are. I think they're kind of like this big. I don't think these are as bad as Elron's swords, not at all. However, they do have a lot of the same detriments. That being, there is no guard on this. It has that lacquered wood handle. It doesn't have any sort of pommel, so these are very, blade heavy choppers, which is fine, but that lacquered wood rounder handle means that edge alignment, not going to be ideal when you get any water or using gauntlets or something like that. It's going to be quite slippery on the handle, and the problem with that being is no guard. Your hands can slip straight onto the blade. Not ideal. So these are still practical and functional and could be used. However, they definitely are a step down from some of the best of the best. All right, switching over to the Hobbit very quickly, looking at Orcrist. It is essentially a falchion. It is a chop-heavy blade. It has that dragon tooth for the handle. In terms of its indexing, its shape, its size, this would be perfectly functional. But because it is a chopper, we don't really need that pommel to be as large. We've got that huge swell for hacking and chopping through things. The grind on it looks fantastic. This would be a beautiful cleaver. I mean, that's why it's called the Goblin Cleaver. Right? In terms of the cross guard or the guard on this one, I think it's acceptable. Personally, I think a cross guard on this would be a little bit more practical, but this is still, I would put this as acceptable, as in I wouldn't mind using this. I wouldn't have too big of an issue using it. I do think you could fix up that guard a little bit. It looks a little bit thick right in between where the handle joins with the blade. There just looks like there's a lot of material there that you probably wouldn't need. Next up, the Orc sword, Saruman's Uruk-hai sword. If we want to call it a sword, I don't even know if we would call it a sword. Bar of steel. This one is also interesting because it's actually not terrible. There's only one problem with it for what it is. So first off, this is supposed to be like a mass-produced type weapon. You're stamping these out. They are just crude pieces of trash, essentially. However, they're very, very effective. The one downside is they have no thrusting capabilities. There is zero thrusting capabilities, so that's not ideal. However, they do have a long cutting surface for hacking and slashing, which the orcs are obviously doing. I do like the right angled point on the backside because that is an armor penetrating point. You switch the blade around and you can get through armor. However, the one flaw with this design is how the handle is shaped. The handle is contoured in such a way that it is only meant to be held one way with the primary edge cutting. For example, if we look at this sword here, I'll bring this one up again, the design of the handle is identical on both sides. So if I hold it this way or I hold it this way, there's no difference. They're identical. However, with this design, it's a design index to be held one way. So if I want to switch it around to use that armor penetrating point as my primary cutting surface, it's going to be very uncomfortable on the handle. Now you can decide whether or not that matters for the orcs. I don't think it does. However, if we brought this design into the real world, that wouldn't be optimal. So fixing up that handle shape, very simple, very easy to do, and adding some sort of point so that this can also thrust, and you're off to the races. Not a refined design, not a elegant design, but perfectly reasonable. And last but not least, let's take a look at Faramir's sword. And this is kind of an example of how amazing the swords are in Lord of the Rings, because Faramir is not a main character, right? You know, he's a secondary character, a side character, and his sword is designed perfectly reasonable. I only have one gripe with it, and that is kind of the disc pommel. I don't personally like that design, and I probably wouldn't go with it, especially for this type of sword, but everything else on it is perfectly functional. The blade is a little bit more plain. You know, we have a good profile taper on it, which means that it would be very light in the hand, especially with that chunky pommel, because it is proportional. Then when it comes to the crossguard is interesting because this is it looks to be recycled from the Ranger sword, from Aragon's Strider sword. It just seems to be flipped upside down, which isn't going to affect the design very much. It sweeps very slightly down. You're not going to notice it. It's still going to be a functional crossguard. So this sword, all in all, will be pretty good. The only thing is that handle. I don't know if that handle is round or not. It kind of looks round on the images, but I'm not entirely sure. But that's kind of a great sword. And it's for a background character. This sword is better than some swords that main characters have in a lot of movies and TV shows. So it's impressive. And like reusing the crossguard, that happens all the time when it comes to films. You know, background characters, you give them elements from other, you know, props and just chuck them on. It's perfectly reasonable. But that is going to be our final sword. So let's talk about the top 3 swords in Lord of the Rings. At least from this list, there might be some other ones that I've missed, obviously. It's not all of them. But the best 3 in this particular list, in no particular order, is Glamdring, Gandalf's sword, absolutely fantastic, beautiful. The Strider sword, Aragorn's sword. A simple sword, but still really, really nice. And then lastly, Boromir's sword. That thing is gorgeous. There's a lot of subtle design in it, but it is a beautiful sword nonetheless. And with that being said, I think that is going to round out today's episode, having a look at the Lord of the Rings swords. Are they functional? Are they not? On average, they are really, really good. These swords are like head and shoulders above a lot of other fantasy movies and TV shows. They have taken the time to do the designs right. They may not be as, you know, crazy fanciful fantasy as other shows, but there's a reason why that works in the Lord of the Rings, is because they're actually functional designs. You don't need these crazy spikes, these crazy designs, these crazy blade geometries and thicknesses and, you know, chunky cross guards to make good swords. You can use a lot of the subtleties and real science behind swords and create designs that look absolutely drop dead gorgeous and also are completely functional and valid. But that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below what you thought of today's episode. And as always, I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one.